is Amanda Cook. I have a picture up here that I feel like just encompasses me. Clearly, it'll come up here. So, it's the two things I love the most, right? Alabama and Chick-fil-A. Like, how could you go wrong? So, for those of you who don't know, I am married to Brian, who is the lead pastor here at ACF. For whatever reason, this guy, he genuinely loves it when we dress alike. He does love it. He thinks it's so funny. And he recently broke out into the jean jacket, and so that kind of gets me a little time. But funny, yesterday that picture came up on my Facebook memory, and his caption says, "My wife's biggest fear in life is that we would become the couple who starts wearing matching clothes." Welcome to the jungle, baby. I'll be honest with you, I never pictured myself as a pastor's wife. When Brian and I started dating, he was going to school to be a mechanic. My dad was a mechanic, so I was very familiar with that lifestyle. And when Brian told me he was thinking about taking a job at a church, I was like, I'm pretty sure that's a bad idea. Like, you would be really good at it, but me as a pastor's wife, I really think that that's terrible, and I could really never post about that on Facebook. All my friends from high school would be like, what? But here we are, 16 years later. We started our ministry journey at a church in Grand Junction, Colorado. We served there for 6 years, and then we jumped on the chance to move to Alaska. We moved here in 2009, so Brian could take over as the youth/worship pastor. At that point in time, ACF had about 30 people in it. And so I was 7 months pregnant with my middle daughter, and my oldest daughter, Cadence, who's actually here today, she was the only one in the nursery downstairs. So it's really amazing to look out. I'm like, this is like 7 times what it was. And now we have 3 children, Cadence, who is 12, Avriana, who is 10, and Grayson, who is 7. It's probably my favorite picture of them. And it was even a couple of years ago, so they're older than that now. And when we moved here, I said, we are on the 5-year plan. Like, let's move to Alaska, experience all of it that we can, and then move back down closer to family. I'm originally from Cheyenne, Wyoming, born and raised, grew up in a Southern Baptist church. My mom sang in the choir, my dad was a deacon, so every time the doors were open, we were there. I would say I had a pretty great childhood, 2 amazing parents who loved me, and an older brother. Here's a picture of us. Look at that guy is just looking at me like, look how much he loves me. He's so sweet. Yeah. And then that's us years later, but we fought all the time, but he was a really great brother. So I would also say I had some pretty great friends growing up, sleepovers every weekend, lots of laughing, some drama. But I do remember one time in particular. I was in junior high. My best friend and I, we were walking to our next class together. She had home ec on one side, which I do think they should bring back to schools, and I had Spanish on the other side. And so we're just laughing and cutting up as we're walking to class. Go to our class, the bell rings afterwards. I come out, run up to her, and I find that for whatever reason, she's no longer speaking to me. She was mad at me for whatever, and I had no idea what had happened. But it was at that point that I learned to hold people at arm's length. We can still be friends, but I'd prefer to keep you here so that I can protect my own feelings. And that's really what I'm excited to share with you about today, is this idea of vulnerability and what this looks like in our lives, in our relationships, in our marriages, and within our families. Some of you may know that I am a runner. At this point, I'm just a washed-up has-been who doesn't run and switched it out for hiking because I can't anymore. But I remember before going into my 9th grade year, the high school coach called me up and he asked me if I was going to come out and run cross country. And I had run in 7th and 8th grade at that point, but wasn't too interested in going out again. And at that point in Cheyenne, 7th, 8th, and 9th is junior high school. And then 10th, 11th, and 12th is high school. But with certain sports, you would come up to the high school to compete once you were a freshman. And cross country and track, the two that I did, were two that you would go up to the high school for. And so he called me asking me if I would come out. I had run cross country and track in junior high, and it was fine. I didn't have a huge interest, but I had won a lot of my races, which is why I think he decided to call me. And so I was like, sure, I don't have anything else, and so I can come out. And he's like, that is so great. Have you been training this summer? And I was like, sure, which I hadn't actually run a single step all summer long. But ironically, I think that I wasn't drawn to going out because I lacked that connection with my team. I beat them by a lot, and so I didn't really have that connection. And so I was like, I don't really feel this need to come out. And so when I decided to go out, now I'm attending classes at junior high and going up to the high school to compete. And I quickly became the #1 runner on the girls' team and was definitely not making any friends along the way. There was this one girl in particular. She was a senior when I was a freshman, and she had paid her dues. She had worked her way up, and her senior year, she just knew that she was in line to be the #1 girl. And I came in, and I was beating her, and she hated me. She absolutely hated me. So by the time I actually walked into high school, my 10th grade year, 4 classes, I learned that I was hated by many people, that there were a lot of rumors about me, and I was just talked about by a lot. And that was when I learned to protect myself by putting up walls. So it was no longer just holding you out at arm's length, but now there was this large barrier so that nobody could hurt me. I learned to cut off all feelings in order not to feel any sort of hurt that was staring me in the face. I would no longer allow anyone to get close enough to hurt me. I just realized that I don't like to feel hurt, and instead of accepting that this is just part of being human, the pain of rejection, the pain of hurt, I made a conscious decision to not feel that and to push everybody away. And maybe some of you in this room have experienced the same thing. I think we do this culturally. Maybe you pull into your driveway, open up the garage, pull in, shut the door before you have any chance to even interact with any of your neighbors. Or maybe you're realizing that the majority of your friends are Facebook friends. Maybe you don't even actually know them, or you've only seen them in person a couple of times, but you like and you comment on their posts, and so you feel this connection between them. You see, we have set up our lifestyles to be very isolated. Humanly, I think it's natural for us to resist personal vulnerability. Our culture, it emphasizes independence, autonomy, and self-sufficiency. And while these things aren't entirely wrong, it really does come to hinder our personal growth and our spiritual growth. And so in learning about this idea of vulnerability, I was introduced to Brene Brown, who, when I was telling Brian about it, he's like, oh yeah, I know Brene Brown, and I didn't know she was a big thing, but evidently she is big. So she's like the guru of vulnerability. She is a researcher by trade and has committed her career to doing research into vulnerability. And vulnerability, it demands connection. So, and we as humans, we are just hardwired for connection. If you want to keep from being vulnerable, then just don't connect. And if you haven't created deep connections, it's because you probably don't want to be vulnerable to those around you. I see this in my own life. Personally, I've been on a journey lately. I started going to counseling about 1.5 years ago, and this idea of vulnerability and an awareness of the walls that I had put up, really brought to light how I was functioning as a human being. And it really caused me to go to my mom and to ask her, like, you go to therapy or counseling, and it's this, let's go back to your childhood. And so I'm thinking, did something happen in my childhood that I'm just not aware of, that my mom could shed some light on too? And she just said a couple of things that kind of caught me. One, she said, if she was ever to raise her voice at me, then I would immediately shut down. And so she could get nowhere with me. She just needed to learn to talk to me in a calm voice. And the other thing that she mentioned that I saw currently in my life is she said, you would have one shot with me. And so we could be friends, but if there was anything that you ever did to hurt me, then you were back out over here. And just one shot. She said, your dad and I, we tried to work with you on that. So I think for me personally, I'm just naturally wired to avoid vulnerability. I don't want it. I have certain triggers in my life that when I feel them, I just instantly shut down. And now I'm far more aware of them. And so when I shut down, I am still able to take a step forward and to re-engage. But I'm just naturally wired to avoid vulnerability at any cost. And what keeps us from connection is this idea that we're not worthy of love and belonging, that maybe we've never felt good enough or safe enough. Maybe we've never felt certain enough or extraordinary enough. And I think the root of what is unraveling connection is this idea of shame. Shame disconnects us from others, and it causes us to doubt our worth. And shame and guilt, they're not the same thing. So guilt is, I feel bad for what I did, whereas shame is, I am bad. And it's this idea that we don't have anything of value to offer others. And then this lie that we don't have anything to offer to others is perpetuated by silence. It can only be exposed as false when we actually speak honestly to each other. It's only when we open up to others that this toxic power of shame can be dispelled. Psalms 139:14 says, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. And shame is based on the lie that that's not true, that our unworthiness actually disqualifies us from the right to connect to God and to connect to others. And believing this lie leaves us feeling profoundly alone and incapable of any sort of intimacy that God created us for, the connection that we were actually hardwired for. Your own doubt about your self-worth is one of the greatest sources of dysfunction in your life. That is true for me and in my own journey of counseling. I think I realized just how much I lost and missed out on because I had always lived with this wall up and I had always had this idea of shame. I think it's really what was at the root of Brian and I just felt like I wasn't good enough to be married to him, and I certainly wasn't good enough to be a pastor's wife. So this shame really drove me. And I just think now, like, what could I have actually accomplished? I turned 40 back in July. What could I have actually accomplished if I wouldn't have let Satan lie to me? He just kept whispering lies into my ears, and I just believed it for years. That's when I think a lot of the shame just really came to the surface for me. And instead of embracing the role that God gave me as a pastor's wife, or just feeling this deep gratitude that Brian chose me to marry, and being thankful for all of the opportunities that he created, I just pushed it away. Don't put me in your pastor's wife box. I don't want anything to do with it. And my name is Amanda, not necessarily Brian's wife, so which is fine. You can call me that. But But refusing to keep silent about the sources of your shame is one of the most significant things that you can do to help you be the person that God created you to be. And that just reminds me the importance of when we make ourselves vulnerable to others, it's going to be an essential driver to our own growth as a person and our spiritual growth. James 5:16, Paul writes, "Therefore confess your sins to one another and pray for one another so that you may be healed." See, shame is at the core, and it's a consequence of the fall. When this idea of being less than God became something painful that we wanted to escape, we became excruciatingly self-conscious, and we felt this need to hide. I think that was what drove me for years, this idea that I'm not perfect. Well, who's perfect? The only one who's perfect is God. So this idea that I'm not perfect really just drove me into shame rather than gratitude. Psalms 32, 3-4 says, "When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through the groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy on me. My strength was sapped as in the heat of the summer." He goes on to say in verse 5, "Then I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin." I mean, how sweet is that? We are called not to hide any of that sin. That's not at all what God has called us to do. And when we come out and we confess that sin to him, he just loves us and he forgives us of that. I think, always a good place to go is the Bible when, really for anything, but on this idea of vulnerability, I was thinking, what are some examples of vulnerability that we read in the Bible? It wasn't in the back, in the index, vulnerability, and then it took me to the different passages, but I think we could definitely start with Paul. I think when we read in 2 Corinthians 12, 7-10, "Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in my weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, and in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong.'" This is a completely different mindset for me. That is not the mindset that I typically operate in. Paul goes on in Romans 7, 21-24. "So I find this law at work. Although I want to do good, evil is right there with me. For in my inner being I delight in God's law, but I see another law at work in me, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within me. What a wretched man I am. Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death?" When Paul says, "What a wretched man I am," it's not this cry of despair or self-hatred or self-loathing, but rather it is the deepest spiritual realization of the distance between what Paul is when the flesh reigns in him versus what he longs to be or is when the Spirit reigns in him. Paul was very open and vulnerable about his weaknesses. He called it his thorn in the flesh. But because of his vulnerability, God had easy access to pour grace into Paul, because Paul wasn't self-defensive or thinking that he needed to be the same as God. Paul positioned himself before God in all of his vulnerability, in all of his weaknesses, and what God did was just pour his grace out on Paul. I think I've always struggled with this concept of grace in my life. I tend to think it's the biggest cop-out, like you just need to work harder and it will be better. I feel like I can talk about grace in your life and how it's transforming. But when it comes to my life, I really operate in this workspace mentality far more than the grace mentality. My color is red for the personality quiz, and so if that gives you any sort of idea. And I'm an 8 on the Enneagram, which is the defender, so that wasn't any sort of a surprise either. So, again, my mentality is, I've messed up, I need to work harder so that I can gain this idea of perfection. John 1:16 says, "From his abundance we have all experienced one gracious blessing after another." That is the New Living Translation. You may have heard it this way. The ESV says, "For from his fullness we have received grace upon grace." So why don't we operate in that grace that God has so lavishly poured on us? Step out of that workspace mentality and accept and position yourself before God and let him lavish his grace upon us. And then another example in the Bible of somebody who is vulnerable, I think, is Jesus. I mean, who's more vulnerable than Jesus? He's the ultimate picture of vulnerability. If we think about the Trinity, you have 3 separate identities, and yet they all come together in perfect community. And the Bible goes on to describe the Son as the perfect picture of vulnerability. Philippians 2:7 says, "Who in becoming man, he emptied himself by assuming the form of a servant. He took on being human and stepped down from being, well, not from being God, but, and he became sin for us," 2 Corinthians 5:21. "And he was emptied in every way as we are." What is more vulnerable than that? The example of Jesus points to the reality that our personal vulnerability, again, is this essential part of our personal growth. Richard Rohr writes in his book, The Divine Dance, "Did you ever imagine that what we call vulnerability might just be the key to ongoing growth? In my experience, healthily vulnerable people use every occasion to expand, change, and grow. Yet it is a risky position to live undefended, in a kind of constant openness to the other, because it would mean others could sometimes actually wound you. But only if we choose to take this risk do we allow the exact opposite possibility. The other might also gift you, free you, and love you." And I think that is just so true. For years, it was keeping everybody away. I don't want to be hurt. I don't want to get close enough to anybody who could wound me. And so I chose to take a step back. And yet, he goes on to say, "But if only we choose to take this risk, do we allow the exact opposite possibility. The other might also gift you, free you, and love you." And Brené Brown, she writes in her book, Daring Greatly, how the courage to be vulnerable transforms the way we live, love, parent, and lead. She defines vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. She goes on to say, vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity, which is probably why I've never been creative in my life, because I've never been vulnerable. So I'm going to try it, and maybe I'll start painting or singing or whatever creative people do. I don't know. It is the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. If we want greater clarity in our purpose or deeper or meaningful spiritual lives, vulnerability is the path. So what are some of the things you think of when you hear the word vulnerability? When I had this question, what did I do? I turned to Facebook, and I put out a survey, and I just asked the question, when you hear the word vulnerability, what does that say to you? Maybe what's the first thing that you think of? And so I got a couple of different answers varying on the scale. I got a weakness. That was definitely I didn't answer my own survey, but that is definitely mine. Before, if you would have said vulnerability, I would definitely say a weakness. Fear, ignorance, exposed. Then on the other side of the spectrum, we have bravery, freedom. Brene Brown describes it as courage. And this one really spoke to me. And I don't think I could have phrased it like this, but she really encompassed my thoughts on this. Her answer was, when I thought of vulnerability coming from someone else, I thought of their bravery and strength. But when I thought about it for myself, I thought of it as a weakness, something that could be used against me. So do we think that vulnerability is really great for other people? Like, I thought grace is really great for other people. Don't operate in workspace, right? Accept that grace. Yeah, I wasn't doing it myself. So what we need to do is we need to start rewiring our brains to associate vulnerability with different words. This is really what I've been doing in counseling for the last year and a half, which at the beginning of this year, I told Brian, I think I'm going to cut back on going to counseling, like maybe once a month or twice a month. And he's like, no, you should probably keep going each week. And I was like, okay. So when we rewire our brains to associate vulnerability with words like joy, love, belonging, creativity, faith, and empathy, once we rewire our brains, this idea of vulnerability can actually start to take root in our lives. What are some of the symptoms that maybe you're losing your tolerance for vulnerability? Maybe this is the first time you've ever even thought about what vulnerability is or what it really means to you. I think one of the symptoms for this idea of losing our tolerance for vulnerability or not being vulnerable is this idea that joy becomes foreboding. So we always have this fearful apprehension that something is going to go terribly wrong if we are vulnerable. Maybe you've adopted disappointment as a lifestyle. If I just constantly live in disappointment, then I can't ever really be disappointed, and you live this even keel. Or maybe you live in a world with low-grade disconnection. You know, I think that that's how I started. I started on low-grade disconnection when I was in junior high, and then it turned into full-on disconnection when I got to high school, to where everybody was cut off. And this idea of perfectionism, this runs in my life. It screams at me all the time. Perfectionism. Perfection is a tool that we use to protect ourselves. For me, it's always my defense mechanism. I don't want anybody to hurt me. I can fully relate to this one. In fact, Brene Brown, she says, if perfection is driving you, then shame is riding shotgun. And I was like, it's so painful to hear. And actually, I see this in my 7-year-old son. He genuinely loves to do the right thing. He genuinely wants to do the right thing. And so when he does make a mistake, it is just this downhill spiral. And it goes from one bad decision to 47 bad decisions. And it's because he feels that shame within him. Another thing that we do for perfection or for vulnerability is we numb ourselves. The problem with numbing yourself is that you can't numb yourself from only the dark feelings. When you numb, you are also numbing joy and gratitude and happiness. And that was definitely how I operated. When you numb, you do not selectively numb your emotions. You will numb yourself to all emotions. So that's why when we hear people say, I don't really care what people think about me, this should send up some huge red flags. I said this for years. Because when we stop caring what people think, then we lose our capacity for connection. And then when we become defined by what people think, we lose our capacity to be vulnerable. So what are some ways to become more vulnerable in your life and build greater connectivity with people? I think the first one is the courage to be imperfect. So you have to let yourself be seen. For me, I would do whatever it took to never fail. I saw it in school. I'm terrible at math. My track coach was my math teacher. I would go in before track practice, after track practice. I made my parents hire me a tutor in the middle of summer so that I could just get better at math. I was so terrible at it. And nothing worked. Absolutely nothing worked. And so I just said, well, that's fine. Then I'll stop trying. Because if I haven't tried, if I haven't put any effort into it, it's not really painful when I get a C or a D or sometimes an F. It just doesn't matter, or it didn't matter to me, because why try if I'm going to fail? The second thing that we need to do is we need to have compassion to be kind to ourselves first and then to others. How can you show other people compassion when you're not kind to yourself first? And Brené Brown says, one thing that you need to do is live as a wholehearted person. So you need to love with your whole heart. There's this picture of Brian and I, and yeah. This is one of my favorite pictures, by the way, just because it's really funny. But as I was looking at it, I was like, how true is this in our marriage? For how many years was Brian leaning in, reaching out to me, saying, I see you and I love you. And I'm back here going, I don't know. So as much as I love this picture, it was kind of painful. I was like, okay. These wholehearted people that Brené Brown talks about are people who have this deep sense of worthiness. Remember, I said what keeps us from connection is this sense that we are not worthy of love and belonging. So let's flip that on its head, and we need to know that we are children of the Most High God, that we are rightful heirs, and because of Jesus, we are worthy. We need to embrace vulnerability by rewiring our brain to believe that what makes you vulnerable is what makes you beautiful. So funny, again, in counseling, I learned, I have a shorter fuse. I just have a shorter fuse. And Brian, he has this really long fuse that coils on the floor, and he never gets angry. It makes me so mad that he never gets angry. And for years, it was just keep trying to have a longer fuse, do whatever you can. And when I was talking to my counselor, she's like, no, that's how God made you. God made you with this shorter fuse. So I think when we embrace what makes us vulnerable, then it's what makes us beautiful, and we can embrace this idea of vulnerability. We should practice gratitude and joy. Malia lent me a book, 1,000 Gifts by Ann Voskamp, and maybe you could start a journal, a gratitude journal. So you're writing down every day or 3 times a day or whenever your fuse runs low. Write down things that you are thankful for daily. And another thing that we can do to embrace vulnerability is know that you are enough. Know I am enough. This is what we talked about last year in our ladies' gathering. In fact, Amanda Hunter made this, and I have this enough on my cup. I didn't even plan that either. That was funny. So knowing that, we need to embrace that and to know that. If you are willing to be emotionally vulnerable, then you can live the most powerful life possible, the life that God has called you into. Vulnerability by itself, it just isn't worth the risk. It doesn't feel good to just be vulnerable, but when it's paired with connection, vulnerability is the pathway to experiencing unconditional love. When you are closed off, you're always thinking, if you knew me, you wouldn't love me. But when you are completely vulnerable with people, there's a risk, yet they know you and they still love you. And in that sense, you're going to be able to experience love in a much deeper way. They know you. They know those less than lovely parts about you, and they accept you and they love you. We aren't typically vulnerable because we think that people are going to walk away, but it's those people who walk away that they're just not worth the risk of it. It's the people who stay with you that are the ones that love you unconditionally because they know you. And the thing that's going to stop all of this idea of embracing vulnerability in its tracks is fear. There's two types of fear of vulnerability. One is this narcissistic mentality. I refuse to be vulnerable. I have all the power, and I don't need anybody. And that is exactly where I lived for years. Or this idea of victim mentality. Everybody else has all of the power, and I need to be manipulative, never honest, and never vulnerable. So what can we do to overcome this fear of vulnerability? It's all about a healthy dependence. First, we need to have a healthy dependence with God and then with others. Mark 12:30 through 31 says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength." The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no greater commandment than these. Vulnerability is taking the risk to expose yourself emotionally. You are going to feel uncertain while doing it. For me, it is just not my natural tendency, so at first it's very uncomfortable. But there is no other way to live that most meaningful life that God has called us to. We were created to be people of connection to God first and then to others. And vulnerability, it is the requirement for achieving that purpose. What I'm not proposing that you do is just go and do this with everybody. You need to have your safe people, your tribe, your group around you. I've been vulnerable in here standing up, sharing that I've been going to counseling, that I'm on this journey, my issues with being a pastor's wife, and that takes a lot of vulnerability. But I don't share everything up here. I have my certain people that maybe I talk to about it more. And so there's even this different levels of vulnerability that we have. You can see this being done wrong in two different types of people. This is Brian. He came up with these for me. He's so funny. He said, he just thinks of these naturally. It just comes off of his head. Like when we were coming up with the hashtags, which, by the way, my hashtag didn't make it into the front cover, but it's hashtag open up buttercup. So didn't make it into that. But he kept going. I was like, what's a hashtag that I could use? And he's like 15 examples in, and I'm like, okay, I need to go to bed. So two different types of people who do this wrong. Maybe you have TMI Trudy. She dumps it all out to everybody who's going to listen. Here's all of my problems, and I'm just going to emotionally throw up on you. Or how about closed off Chloe? She has unhealthy fear and therefore never opens up to anybody. Those are two people or two different types of people who do this wrong. So what does this look like for us as women in this room, as women of ACF, as God's children? I propose this: a vision for a community of women who know and accept each other in a deeper and more profound way. This may be the opposite of what we think when we think about church, but this can become a catalyst for a lot of deep relationships between all of us, and for our friends on the outside to come in and to know Jesus as well. Not everybody is going to do this well. Some people are going to let us down, but the outcome of an authentic community is worth the risk, and the joy of authentic community is worth the risk. So let's pray. Father God, we just love you so much. And I just ask as your people that we would start rewiring our brains to live in this world of vulnerability, God, where we have this deep connection with you and this deep connection with others. Father God, I pray that we know and will accept how much you love us, God, and I pray that relationships, deep relationships, can start to form today, Father God. We just thank you for everything that you have done, and we ask this in your Son's name. Amen.